His word can be trusted. His word still comes true. God's word, the Bible, answers life's deepest questions. Receive the word, a message of hope for today.
Thank you for tuning in to today's broadcast of Receive the Word, a ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Southeast Michigan. My name is Ariel, and I'm the pastor of the Oakwood Seventh-day Adventist Church in Taylor. And I am here with my friend Nate Gibbs, who is pastoring two churches, one in Adrian and another in Belleville. Welcome, Nate.
Hey Ariel, it's good to be joining you and our listeners for another program. As we've done in the past, before we engage today's topic, we're going to hear an opening message from one of our ministry partners, Pastor Sean Boonstra from It Is Written. So we ask that you please open your heart to receive the word through today's opening message.
Does God really exist? And if he does, do you think he really pays attention as we hurtle through space on this little blue planet? Or is he more like an absentee landlord who started the planet spinning a long time ago and then forgot about us? Today, we're going to look at an ancient book that gives startling evidence for the existence of God and proves that not only does he notice us, but his hand is still steering history toward one incredible final event. Presented by Sean Boonstra. The hand that guides the future.
The Duke of Wellington and Napoleon Bonaparte had a lot in common. Both of them were born on an island in 1769. Both of them lost their fathers in early childhood and had 4 brothers and 3 sisters. Both attended military school in France at the same time. Both excelled at mathematics, and both became lieutenant colonels within 1 day of each other. And perhaps most importantly, both of them are remembered for what happened at the Battle of Waterloo. They were evenly matched, with similar backgrounds, similar education, and even similar armies. But that day, Napoleon lost and the Duke of Wellington won. And if you ask a historian why it happened, they'll point out a number of things. First of all, they'll tell you the terrain they were fighting on was the kind that Wellington liked, so he had the home team advantage, so to speak. Secondly, Napoleon didn't count on the Prussian army going 15 miles out of their way to join the fight. And lastly, historians point out that Napoleon just didn't have the same kind of courage and energy he had before his exile. So there are lots of ideas as to why Napoleon lost. But the one thing that many people agree on is that he probably could have won. And the map of Europe would look a lot different today if he had. Yet something tipped the scales decidedly in Wellington's favor. And it wasn't just strategy or coincidence or the size of an army or fatigue or weather or any of those things. It was something more. There was an invisible hand that refused to allow Napoleon to win. In fact, something happened 2,500 years earlier in an ancient Babylonian king's bedroom that determined what would happen that day at Waterloo. The Bible talks about it in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, where it is written, "Now in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him." It was the middle of the night, and the most powerful man on earth suddenly woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding and his pillow soaked with sweat. Even though he had been on the battlefield many times, and even though he had seen the ugly reality of death up close, he was now afraid of a dream. So he got out of bed and called an emergency meeting of some of the most trusted advisors in his empire, the men who claimed to know the very secrets of the universe. The Bible continues in Daniel 2, verse 2. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. No problem, they said. Nebuchadnezzar, you just tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means. And as the astrologers and magicians pulled out their charts and dream interpretation books, the king suddenly smelled a rat. He got this not-so-funny feeling that the men who had been guiding the affairs of his kingdom might not really know what they're talking about. So he refused to tell them the dream, but still insisted that they figure it out. If you are what you claim you are, he said, you should be able to figure out the dream and the interpretation. And if you can't, I'll put every last one of you to death. You know, a cold shiver must have run up and down their spines, because in their hearts, they knew that their books and charts were completely powerless to help them. Not one of them could reach inside the king's mind and extract the information he needed. So they pled for more time. But Nebuchadnezzar was on to them. Listen, he said, you've been lying to me for years, haven't you? My word is final. Either you figure out what I dreamed, and you tell me what it means, or you're all gonna die. But we can't do that, Your Majesty, they said. We just can't read your mind. Here's how the Bible tells the story in Daniel chapter 2, beginning now in verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious, and gave a command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. You know, I find it very interesting that when something important happened that changed the course of history forever, the psychics and astrologers didn't know anything about it. And believe me, even though late-night TV is still full of people who have psychic hotlines and star charts, those people still don't know what's going to happen. You see, if God has something important to say, He doesn't use tarot cards or star charts or crystal balls. He just comes out and says it. Watch how this works. The second chapter of Daniel tells us that because the so-called wise men couldn't perform, Nebuchadnezzar rounded them up to be put to death. And as they went through the kingdom to find all the Chaldeans, they knocked on the door of a Hebrew captive named Daniel, who was also considered a wise man because of his royal blood, his great intelligence, and his godly life. But Daniel was not like the Chaldeans. In fact, he was the real thing, a genuine prophet of God. Take me to the king, Daniel said, and they did. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 16 says, So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation. Now, for some reason, the king trusted Daniel, maybe because he had proven himself in the past, and he gave Daniel the time he asked for. So Daniel went back to his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they got down on their knees and prayed for answers, because they knew that if it was important, God would tell them. And sure enough, God did. The very next day, they brought Daniel back to the king. Daniel 2 and verse 27 says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. Nebuchadnezzar, said Daniel, your wise men couldn't tell you the dream, and honestly, I can't tell you either. I can't take any credit for what I'm about to tell you, but there's a God in heaven who knows everything and controls everything. and He showed me your dream. It's about the last days of planet Earth, and this is what you dreamed. From that point on, Daniel tells the king something that has changed the course of world history, and it's even affected the way you live today. In fact, it's even the real reason Napoleon lost at the Battle of Waterloo. Here's what the Bible says the king dreamed. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar was excited. That's it, Daniel, he said. I can't believe it. That's exactly what I dreamed. It was a giant statue made of different metals. It had a golden head and silver arms and brass thighs and iron legs and clay feet. And then a giant rock flew out of the sky and smashed it to pieces, and the wind blew the pieces away. And the rock grew until it filled the whole earth. Daniel, that's exactly what I dreamed. But what in the world does it mean? Let me tell you what it means. What we're about to read proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that we are not alone in the universe, because hundreds and thousands of years in advance, the Bible predicted the rise and fall of every major world empire. It proves conclusively that nothing is left to mere chance. The invisible hand of God steers the affairs of men. Here's what Daniel told the king in Daniel chapter 2, verse 37. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, He has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. The golden head in the dream represents Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. It was the greatest of empires, the most decadent, literally drenched in luxury and gold. It was the head of all empires. But it didn't last forever. Listen now as Daniel continues in verse 39. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. History tells us that the Babylonian Empire crumbled when the Medes and Persians sacked the city in 539 BC. And it didn't matter that they weren't as talented in the battlefield as the Babylonians, because an unseen hand tipped the scales in their favor. You see, wherever God steers history, that's where it's going to go. And He has a very specific destination in mind. The Medes and the Persians, represented by the chest and arms of silver, ruled the Middle East until 331 BC, when another army destroyed them. According to the Bible in Daniel 2:39, it was, quote, Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. The third kingdom, represented by the belly and thighs of brass, was the Greek empire of Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. Alexander managed to conquer, on foot, 20 million subjects over 2 million square miles in something like 4 years, all by the time he was 32 years old. Alexander was completely unstoppable because he had the unseen hand of God allowing him to win. But even Alexander came to an end in 168 BC. That's when the Fourth Empire destroyed the Macedonians, as the Bible predicted in Daniel 2 and verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. If you remember your grade school history, you already know which empire humbled the Macedonians. It was the Romans, the same empire that ruled the world when Jesus Christ was born. They were more ferocious than any army the world had ever seen, and they literally stomped all over Europe and the Middle East, subjecting everything in their path. Here's how the famous historian Edward Gibbon described them amazingly in his book Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the images of gold, silver, or brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. It's as if Gibbon was familiar with the Bible, because that's exactly what God said would happen. It's even in the same language. The head of gold was Babylon. The chest and arms of silver were Medo-Persia. The belly and thighs of brass were Greece. And the Roman Empire, the legs of iron, eclipsed them all. Because of the unseen hand of God, nobody stood a chance in the face of a Roman army. But Rome too would fail. And now follow me very carefully, because we're going to see the real reason Napoleon didn't win. Daniel 2 and verse 41 continues. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Daniel told the king, more than 1,000 years in advance, that the Western Roman Empire would crumble and break into 10 pieces like the 10 toes on your feet. And it happened exactly the way God said it would, because barbarian tribes brought Rome to its knees by 476 AD. And the Western Empire broke into exactly 10 pieces. Not 9, not 11, but 10. And those barbarian tribes, at least the ones that survived, became the nations of Western Europe today. It all happened exactly the way God said it would. And furthermore, the Bible tells us that try as they might, those 10 tribes will not adhere to each other. The great unseen hand of God has tipped the scales against anybody who tries to put the Western Roman Empire back together. He says they shall not cleave one to another, and God is not about to change His mind. That's why every single attempt, every experiment to unite Western Europe has failed miserably. The royal families tried to use marriages to do it, but it never worked. The warrior King Charles, for example, almost put Europe back together. But just as he closed in on uniting Western Europe, a revolution broke out and he was forced to abdicate the throne. Louis XIV, the Sun King, tried to unite Europe, but other countries fought back fiercely. And so many of the biggest, strongest men from France were killed that some have estimated that the average French male is still 2 inches shorter than he used to be as a result. And then came Napoleon. He was so arrogant that he crowned himself emperor in 1804. In fact, when it came time for the Pope to put the crown on his head, Napoleon took it away and put it on himself. He thought nothing could stop him. But there's one thing he forgot. The unseen hand of God, which said they shall not adhere to one another. So in 1812, Napoleon marched on Russia, and God tipped the balances against him. It had nothing to do with Russian military might. It had everything to do with God. It started to snow, and out of more than 600,000 French soldiers who went to Russia, 500,000 never came home. And from that miserable defeat, and after a humiliating exile, Napoleon went to Waterloo, and he lost, because God said nobody would reunite the Western Roman Empire. Everybody who's tried it has failed. The Kaiser failed, even though he probably could have done it. Hitler failed, even though in 1942 it looked like he might win. They all failed to reunite Western Europe because God said they shall not adhere to one another. And nothing changes the unseen hand of God. The Western Roman Empire will not be reunited. In the spring of 2003, there was a battle in the Security Council of the United Nations between the nations of Western Europe. Unity completely fell apart over the issue of Iraq. And on top of that, the European economic community always seems to run into trouble, with some nation failing to live up to its obligations or failing to balance its budget. Try as they might, they will never bring the Western Roman Empire under one ruler or one king. It just can't happen, because God said they shall not adhere to one another. The nations of Western Europe will remain divided until the rock in Nebuchadnezzar's dream comes and smashes the kingdoms of earth. Daniel 2 verse 44 says, "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." Nebuchadnezzar, says Daniel, do you see what's going to happen? One day, your Babylonian empire is going to collapse. And after that, there will be 3 more empires. And after those empires, there will be a time of a divided empire. And finally, God Himself is going to set up a kingdom that will last forever. You know, you and I are living down in the very tiptoes of that image. And the next event in that prophecy is the setting up of God's kingdom. And that happens when Jesus Christ returns. Matthew 25 says in verse 31, "When the Son of Man comes in His glory, and all the holy angels with Him, then He will sit on the throne of His glory." 4 world empires. Every one of them has already come and gone. Then a divided Western Roman Empire, which is still with us to this day. You and I are living under the last human governments described in Daniel chapter 2. And the very next event is the second coming of Jesus Christ. The Rock of Ages, the cornerstone that the builders rejected, is going to fill this planet with His glory and set up His own kingdom. So let me ask you, are we just an insignificant speck in the universe? Absolutely not. God Himself is eventually going to move to planet Earth. Revelation chapter 21 and verse 3 says this, "And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them. And they shall be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God." It's almost over. We're almost there. And if you've been worried about recent world events, stop worrying, because the unseen hand of God is still at work. No matter what happens, nothing will stop Jesus from coming back. He's going to establish His kingdom, and you can be a part of that. You know, all kids ask just one question when they're on vacation, don't they? Are we there yet? My parents used to tell me to watch for certain landmarks so I'd know when we were getting close. God's children want to know too. Are we there yet? And God in His love gives us great landmarks of history to watch for. So let me ask you, since we're almost there, have you made things right with your God?
Beyond the sunset, oh blissful morning, when with our Savior heaven has begun, earth's toiling ended, oh glorious dawning, beyond the sunset, joy.
You might ask yourself why God bothers with a little sin-ridden planet like ours. But don't forget, He's made a huge investment in the human race. He bought us with His own blood, and Jesus has become one of us, a part of the human race. His greatest desire is to come and put an end to earthly kingdoms with all their suffering and set up His own. Wouldn't you like to be a part of that kingdom? Wouldn't you like to tell God that you plan on being there?
Welcome back, dear listeners, to Receive the Word. That was a wonderful overview of the prophetic timeline given to us in Daniel chapter 2. Pastor Sean Boonstra presented for us not simply a historical lineup of different nations, but Nate, I appreciate how he finishes off with the greatest historical event we humans will get to experience, and we know that it's going to be happening pretty soon, the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, we want to kind of develop further on this, on the theme of the second coming. When Jesus was with his disciples towards the end of his ministry, he made some statements regarding Jerusalem being destroyed. And the disciples were in shock because he also mentioned the temple being destroyed, which to them was startling. So they asked Jesus the questions of, what will be the signs when all of this whole planet will go into the end, will meet its end. And Jesus begins to present to them various scenarios. And I would like to invite our listeners to Matthew chapter 24. Jesus begins by warning them of deceptions and all these false signs. But I want us to spend the time in the program focusing on some parables that Jesus gave us regarding the second coming. I'm reading from Matthew chapter 24, verses 42 through 44. It reads as follows. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the household had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will.
So it's obvious that Jesus believes that we can be ready, otherwise he wouldn't say so.
That's right. And not just that, Nate, his disciples asking for signs, and Jesus is emphasizing preparation, being ready. So I wanted us to spend, Nate, some time on these parables that Jesus...
Yeah, because he continues to give parables that describe how we should be ready.
That's right. He doesn't simply say be ready and leaves the disciples wondering, well, what does that mean? Through these parables, Jesus will teach us how to be ready, because the reality is, Nate, though he gives all of these prophetic signs, at the same time he says, you don't know. You won't know when it will happen. Actually, it will happen when you least expect it. So let us begin this program looking at some of the parables. And Nate, I want us to look at the parable of chapter 24, verses 45 through 51, the faithful and the unfaithful servant. Jesus is speaking this parable. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find doing so. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to drink and eat with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour when he is not aware of it, and will cut him in two and appoint him his portions with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's a very clear-cut parable with a not very happy ending, Nate. Jesus is not trying to be gruesome or negative. I think that the reason he finishes with the servant being cut in two is simply Jesus trying to drive the point that it will be easy for us to lose our passion or wait for his second coming to take place. And so Jesus is being very emphatic in saying, you need to be sure you're ready. This, you cannot miss this, being prepared for this. I want us to focus on some parts of this parable, especially of the servant that was not ready. Jesus spends more time developing that part of the parable. It says, but if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming. We get a perception of this servant's heart. Jesus doesn't focus just on the fact that he is drinking and eating and beating up his servants. He gives us the reason why. In his heart, there is an attitude. And it's not an attitude against, well, I hope my master never comes back. But rather, my master is taking a lot longer than I thought he was going to. So let me become careless and begin to do things that are harmful to not just the believers around me, but to himself. I have some questions about this servant. Why would he get violent with his fellow servants? I mean, they're serving the same master. What does they have this reaction towards his goods? Obviously, the food and the wine that he's drinking belongs to his master, and he's being wasteful with it. One of the things that came to mind, Nate, is the tendency of, once we begin our Christian journey, of giving what is called eye service. When I'm being looked at, when I go to church, the giving the appearance of betrays us. We know when we are being a shell. We know when our heart is not in it. And we may pretend because, well, it's our family. Our family has been Christians for 3, 4, 5 generations. We've been in the same church. But this attitude of my master is not coming for a long time speaks about those Christians that have been Christians for maybe 2 or 3 generations. And this is a strong appeal to them of saying, are you genuine? Because spirituality is not inherited just simply by having the same last name or belonging to the same church or having your granddaddy be the one that put the foundational bricks or your mom, bought the carpet or the pews. Those things are meaningless when it comes to being ready for the second coming of Jesus. So I thought about when I do things so that other people will see me, rather than worrying about what God sees in my heart. That in itself, Nate, I think produces an attitude of cynicism and negativity that let me hear about anything else of the gospel except the second coming of Jesus. But when we look at the book of Acts, if there's one predominant theme, and in the book of Revelation,
it's the second coming.
The second coming of Jesus captivated the discussion, captivated their imagination. But I wonder, Nate, if we were to go randomly throughout an entire year to the churches in the area, how many sermons would we hear about the second coming of Jesus? Or how many sermons would we hear about other topics other than? Could it be that Jesus knew that the closer of his second coming would be, he's not speaking about pagans. He is speaking about the heart attitude of church-going believers, that they would be backbiting and fighting with one another and definitely tired of waiting. 2 Peter, I want us to look at 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 4. Peter, inspired by the Spirit, speaks about this condition and says to the Christians, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So Peter, and he goes on to explain, that these people are willingly ignorant. But just these 2 points, that this attitude of scoffing, the attitude of, yeah, my dad used to say Jesus is coming soon. Yeah, my grandpa used to tell me Jesus is coming soon. But he's dead, my dad is dead, and Jesus still hasn't come. Where is this promise? I think that we need to begin to be honest with ourselves. Is that attitude developing inside of me? Not just only that, but I guess during the program, we will be discussing how to prevent that or how to cure if that attitude begins to creep in. Nate, what are your thoughts about this beating this fellow servants, eating and drinking with the drunkards?
Well, I think sometimes in the Christian experience, if the emphasis has been on the soon coming of Jesus, maybe you heard it when you were a child or when you got converted and you start reading the scriptures, you think it's going to come soon. So your Christian experience is almost mapped out like a sprint. You know, even me, when I was converted, I was 20. I never thought I would reach 30, and I'm 34 now. So I thought, if I just pace myself for 10 years, work really hard, Jesus will be here. And so some of this applies to me, and I can even see how some of maybe the things that you mentioned started creeping in. And the problem is if you were running a race like a sprint, you're going to get tired.
Yeah.
And if it's actually a marathon, the people who've been pacing themselves, and not to say that when I mean pace, I don't mean neglecting spiritual things because, but you're preparing for the long haul to be a Christian. Sometimes people say it's easier, I've heard it said it's easier to die as a martyr, but it's harder to live a Christian because you're dead.
Yeah, it's done.
Next thing you see is Jesus coming back. But when you have to live day in and day out and plug through, it would have been easier to be already up in heaven now. And so what happens is I think you see people passing you. Like you start running out, you start scoffing, and you want to make sure that people are, you're trying to pull them down so that you're better than them.
You don't feel the pain of saying, man, I'm falling behind, and I thought I was going to be one of the first ones through that finish line.
So I don't think in today's day and age you're going to actually, physically beat your fellow worshipers, but you're going to persecute them. You're going to talk behind their back. You're going to say they're overzealous, they're a fanatic. You're trying to pull them down on your level. Your lack in shallowness inside, and you want to kind of make sure that they're on equal playing field. Actually, you probably want to push them down below you. So it's almost like the runner in the race. He's getting past, all of a sudden he starts tripping and doing stuff to interfere with the racers just so that they stay out ahead.
Or worse yet, you stop racing and start making fun of those that keep running and saying this race is bogus. Yeah. You mentioned about that metaphor of the race, and it automatically made me think of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. And in a very real sense, we're going to look at what this verse speaks of. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. And here's the metaphor. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Now, we're going to look at, in a very real way, through these parables, on what it means to look at Jesus, what it means to serve Jesus, what it means to do things for Jesus, because it is that gives us the impetus, the endurance. Now, you mentioned about, 10 years, and boom, Jesus is here. I'm so glad I went to those evangelistic series, heard the gospel, and I'm in. But I want us to look at Jude. Jude is a tiny little book, one chapter long, right before the book of Revelation. And Jude speaks about someone that ran this race long before you and I existed. In Jude chapter 14 and verse 15,
it's actually verse 14 and 15.
Verse 14 and 15? Oh.
Yeah. Just want to make sure. You just said it was one chapter.
Oh, yes. You're right. Verses 14 and 15. No chapter needed. It speaks about a character that may be well known by many Christians. It says this: Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, also saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them on all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him, capital H. So obviously Jude is talking about Enoch prophesying about the coming of Jesus, but they're specific, with 10,000s of his saints. Jesus came to a manger the first time. So this is definitely speaking about the second coming of Jesus. Now Enoch spoke about this about 6,000 years ago, and he lived about 300 years. So, if we were to, eat well, not smoke, and do all these things and be healthy, we may reach 100. But if after 10 years or 15 years of being a Christian, I'm already weary. Hebrews talks about we are surrounded by such a greater cloud of witnesses. And Enoch is one of these witnesses that he talked with conviction. Jesus is coming again. This world will come to an end. And he preached that for 300 years. That should give us a little bit of, if his faith can endure, if he learned how to run this race with endurance, fixing his eyes on Jesus, then so can I. So can you and I,
Amen.
Nate.
Amen.
And so can our listeners, to not get wearied of waiting for Jesus to come the second time, to immunize our heart, to be prevented, to protect our hearts from developing this apathy, developing indifference, creating lethargy attitude of, yeah, Jesus may come someday, but not in my lifetime. That is a dangerous attitude to take. Nate, why don't you talk about this being prepared concept that we get from these parables?
Well, it's interesting. He talked about, the delay. Then the very next parable, it's like he's elaborating on that, to prepare for the delay. And we find that with the parable in chapter 25 about the virgins. Starting in verse 1, it says, "Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins, who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise, and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps, but no oil with them. But the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept." So there's that delay. "And at midnight a cry was heard, Behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, No, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered and said, Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming." So this parable isn't just talking about preparing for the second coming, but it's almost like we have to prepare for the delay. Because both had their lamps. The lamp in the Bible is described as the word. The word is like a lamp, and so they both had their word. They knew what it said, but one had an experience with oil, and one ran out of oil. Zechariah is very clear that the oil is talking about the Spirit. You find it in Zechariah chapter 4. 1 through 7. But there's this link between the Holy Spirit and the Word of God. It's not just knowing the Word intellectually, it's having this devotional experience.
Like Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, you must know him in spirit and in truth, not just truth.
Amen. And so we have to have that experience. Like you said, it's not just intellectual knowledge. We have to have something deeper. And now they're also it's not 5 virgins and 5 prostitutes.
Yes.
Right? It's 10 pure women. They're virgins. They're pure. They're, it's not like it's where it says faithful and evil servants. It says they're wise and foolish. And so there's a difference the difference between the wise and the foolish is having that spiritual connection. And the way they stay spiritually connected is having a devotional life, a prayer life. You're reading your Bible not to see what, facts you can find, but you're reading the Bible and you're praying to Jesus in a devotional way. You're trying to build a relationship, because at the end, the ones that were foolish, Jesus says to them, I don't
know you.
I don't know you. So it's not facts and statistics and Bible, just general knowledge. It's a devotional reading of the scriptures that is with prayer to build a relationship, because we want to be known by Jesus.
The word devotional itself comes, I guess, from the root word of devoted. Someone that is devoted means they're committed, which again brings us back to the theme of marathon running. A marathon runner is committed for the long haul, not just for the short. So maybe, Nate, we can bring some of these concepts together and start meshing them, that if we are believers in Jesus Christ and we are longing for his second coming, we should be pacing ourselves in a way that we will be running as Christians for the rest of our lives, if that's what it takes. And we will not let up the pace, but rather be devoted and committed. And how easy, you're a pastor. I'm sure that it's so easy for you to have a devotional life, Nate. I'm sure that the Lord wakes you up in the morning, and you, as soon as you get up, you feel like reading 10 chapters of the Bible, and prayer life is just such easy thing for you to do every single day. It's pastors, that for us, that's a piece of cake, correct?
No, the Bible's very clear that there is a nature in us that kind of fights against that, and my flesh is no different than anyone else that's listening's flesh. So there's still a fight, and this is the interesting thing: you can't fight someone else's fight, because what happened?
Yeah.
The foolish said, "Give me some of yours," and they couldn't. You can't rely on your pastor to get you into heaven.
Right.
You can't rely on your parents. You can't rely on anyone else.
Your spouse, your kids.
You have to have your own devotional life. And the thing is as a pastor, you could be reading and studying for your sermon and be totally shallow and devoid of the Spirit, because it just becomes your job.
Or a pride thing of looking at all these cool facts that I found. I think that this is very rich for us as Christians, Nate, to search our hearts. Because there's nothing wrong with saying, wow, you know what, I have been neglectful of my devotional life. I have not been reading as I should. I have not been praying as I should. I think that's a healthy thing. That's like a person running a marathon realizing, hey, my legs aren't moving. I'm not running. I want to run, and I want to run in a committed way. Nate, what if some of our listeners are wondering, well, I open the Bible and it's just this big ocean of words, and I don't even know how to begin navigating. What kind of resources could our listeners take advantage of?
We have some book offers and Bible studies. If you go to www.receivetheword.com, that's www.receivetheword.com. They have Bible study offers there. There's a free book offered, Steps to Christ. Excellent way to kind of begin to kind of look at, does God love me? What do I, the very simple things that get you closer to Jesus.
Amen.
And once you start reading the Bible studies and reading these books, it starts like exercising you, and you can just take off and start swimming in the ocean
Amen.
for yourself. But sometimes it is a tough place to start. You're like, where do I even begin? And so we want to be able to provide that for you. So again, www.receivetheword.com. You also can call 734-506-8188, and there's free offers available there. You can ask for the book Steps to Christ or the Bible studies. And again, that's 734-506-8188. And again, www.receivetheword.com.
All right. I hope that our listeners will take advantage. Our prayer is that for each program that these messages will stir your heart to want to draw closer to the Lord, and of course be devoted to spending time with Him in meaningful Bible study and meaningful time in prayer. Let us go back to the parables, Nate, and now we're going to get into the parable of the talents. It just followed the faithful and unfaithful servant, the 5 wise and foolish virgins. And now we're going to get into the parable of the talents. Now, it's a pretty lengthy parable, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. Just simply summarize that a master of a household was going to leave, and he picked 3 of his servants, and to one servant he gave 5 talents, to the other one 2, and to the third servant he gave 1 talent. And when he went away, the first 2 worked and used and invested that talent, and the one that had 5 ended up with 10, and the one that had 2 ended up with 4, and the one that had 1 talent, Nate, how many talents did he end up with?
0.
Yeah, well, he ended up, you're right, with 1, but under the earth.
Yeah.
He buried it. And so when the householder came back, asking, well, what have you done with my talent? The first servant says, look, master, I've doubled it. I took 5 and here's 10. The other one came and said, you gave me 2 and here's 4. But the one that had 1, we're going to spend some time in his answer. I want to first focus on this master. Jesus spends a little bit of time giving us a little detail of the heart of this master. It says, and to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. This is very important. To each according to their own ability. This speaks about a master who knew his servants personally. He knew their abilities, he knew their limits, and so he only gave them what they will be able to handle. So not only does he personally know his speaking about relationships, personally know his servants, he's also a just and fair master, a good master. He's not going to overtax you. He's not going to give you a task that's beyond your abilities. He'll give you just what you are able to do. So that little bit of an insight Jesus mentions at the beginning of the parable, because it's meaningful how it ends with the one that receives 1 talent. When in verse 24, the one with the 1 talent is engaged by the master, he responds to him. Then who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed, and I was afraid. Did this servant really know his master?
No, because it's funny because the master provided everything.
Yes.
And he didn't even provide. He was basically just gave him the 1.
Yes. Now, it's interesting that Jesus in the parable of the virgins ends with, I do not know you. In this parable, the punchline is, I knew you from the servant to the master, when the reality is, this servant did not know his master, which links back to what the spending time with the Lord. If I don't know who I am serving, it will affect my service. If I do not know the character of my master, it will affect with what I will do with my talent for him. And in summary, Nate, I believe that this talent represents our time, our lives. Where does my time get invested? Because, Nate, it's so much easier to hit that snooze button a couple of more times and wake up with just enough time to have breakfast and run out the door, or to have a little bit of sacrifice of time and spend time with the Lord in meaningful Bible study and meaningful prayer. It makes a difference. If I do not know who I am serving, it will affect my service. And it will affect how I respond to him, because in this servant's eye, in his mind's eye, he is totally justified for not using his talent. You are a hard master. You asked too much of me. But the beginning of the parable says that he had received a talent according to what he could. It is imperative, Nate, for us to spend time learning about who we are serving, because it will affect our service. Nate, let us go now to the last parable that we're going to be looking at in this program.
Again, this is a longer parable, so I'm just going to kind of describe it. And this is kind of the famous one about the sheep and the goats, and in describing how there's sheep and goats, and you had the divide, and the sheep's are on one side and the goats on the other. And it's good to be a sheep in this parable.
Yes.
But it's interesting because the sheep and goats are both clean animals in the Bible, and they're both animals that were acceptable in the sacrificial system. So again, just like the virgins, it's not describing sheep and pigs or lizards or, snakes. These are, this is not describing, people that are not in Christ. These are described as people who are clean, and, the animals are describing of the character of Christ. Mm-hmm. These were sacrificial animals representing Christ. But it's going to kind of show that there's something going on here within this, that the exterior is not good enough. Now, what was the difference between the sheep and the goat? Well, basically, one group Jesus comes to and said, because you did this, this, and this to these people, you did it to me. Therefore, you can come to heaven. Mm-hmm. And then he turns to the goats and he says, because you did not do this, this, and this. You didn't feed those that were hungry. You didn't clothe the naked, and you didn't take care of these people. You did not do this to them. Therefore, you did not do that to me. And you're not going to heaven. He's making a clear judgment call based on what they've done. And based on a lot of this, like you said, the talents, he's getting a little more specific. It's not just you can just use your talents for anything. You can't just, okay, I got, this much, wealth, therefore I'm going to double it and just build a new church. He specifically says we need to use talents to help those that are needy.
And when we read earlier in Hebrews, when it said, putting our eyes on Jesus, these people did not realize that they were seeing Jesus in the less fortunate. Because Jesus makes it practical. When you have done it to these, you have done it unto me. And as Christians, we need to see that when we look at poor people, we literally are, in a very literal sense, we are looking at Jesus, because Jesus, when he lived down here, he lived in the worst neighborhoods. He had no place to sleep. He had no wealth. He had no money. He was living at the mercy and compassion of other people who will provide for his means. So when we do those things for humans that are less fortunate than us, it speaks about who we are serving. Because it's not simply, well, I'll use this for a church. Well, are there other needs that are necessary as well within the community of that church, or within my own sphere of influence, that the means that God has provided for me can be used for the benefit of other people?
I mean, Jesus made it very clear. The second great commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And it's linked with the first, love God with your whole heart. Here he's definitely linking it. He's like, the way you treat others is the way you treat me. You don't really love God with your whole heart if you're neglecting the saints.
Now, I would add as a pastor, so that we have a balance. And Jesus loved this focus of balance, in that as we give the gospel to people, we cannot neglect their physical needs. But as we minister to people's physical needs, we cannot neglect their spiritual needs as well. Give them a sandwich, but give them the bread of life. Clothe them, but then show them the righteous robe of Jesus that can cover their mistakes. I think both of them go hand in hand. And maybe, Nate, this is the secret for not losing sight of our desire for Jesus to come again.
It's kind of interesting. I heard this stat that if you focus so much on the last time events as a church body, you'll start neglecting the community around you. But if you start focusing on the community around you, you'll neglect the idea of the second coming. But when we've studied these 4 parables, we see that
you can't separate them.
You can't separate them. If you think Jesus is coming soon, you better be helping the community by both the physical needs and the spiritual needs. And I think a great error has crept into the church with this idea that you can be as selfish as you want and accept Jesus. Because it's very clear that if by mistreating these other people and rejecting the marginalized and the outcast, you haven't accepted Jesus. You're actually rejecting Jesus.
And you will hear that words, I never knew you.
Like that was mentioned.
Now, dear listeners, I hope that this has encouraged you to go back to the Bible and study further on these parables. We covered just barely all these things, all the lessons that we could gather from these. We want to encourage you to also be like the Bereans, who in Acts 17:11 would search the scriptures daily, seeing what God had to show them and guide them in their lives. This is Pastor Ariel, along with Pastor Nate. Until we meet again in the Receive the Word, God bless you.
Receive the Word is a ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Southeast Michigan. For more information, go to ReceiveTheWord.com. That's ReceiveTheWord.com. Or you can call 734-506-8188. That's 734-506-8188. You can also write to us at Receive the Word, P.O. Box 23357, Detroit, Michigan, 48223. That's P.O. Box 23357, Detroit, Michigan, 48223.